Millionaire hires a nanny for his autistic daughter, but hidden cameras reveal a shocking truth. Roger Collins felt fatigue that went beyond the physical. At 35, he was recognized as one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation, a man whose fortune represented the pinnacle of effort and determination. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw only the marks of sleepless nights and worries that didn't involve spreadsheets or contracts. His biggest challenge was not in the figures or the meetings, but in the fragility of his own daughter, Chloe. 7 years ago, Roger had known what he believed to be the purest love and the most excruciating pain at the same moment. The joy of holding Chloe in his arms for the first time was immediately eclipsed by the devastating news. Laura, his wife, had not survived childbirth. Since then, he had become a divided man, with a heart that was half father, half widower. Every day when he looked at Chloe, he saw Laura's delicate features, but also the reminder that he had failed them both. Chloe, on the other hand, was a universe in herself. Diagnosed with autism when she was 8 months old, she demanded more than Roger believed he could offer. Every doctor's appointment, every weekly therapy was a reminder of how much she depended on him, and it destroyed him. He loved her with every fiber of his being, but he carried the weight of a cruel doubt. Was it enough? Before I continue this heartwarming story, I'd like to ask you for something very special. Subscribe to my channel and help me reach my dream 1,000 subscribers. Can I count on your help? Thank you. And now let's continue. For the first few years, he tried to do everything himself, changing diapers, calming seizures, leading her into a world that he himself didn't understand. But wear and tear soon made this impossible. The responsibility was overwhelming, and it was then that he decided to hire help. Babysitters came and went, promises of care that fell apart in practice. Some lacked patience, others were impersonal, and many simply couldn't make a real connection with Chloe. The cycle was always the same: endless interviews, a brief hope, and then the inevitable disappointment. Each new match made Chloe more withdrawn, and Roger more desperate. He felt like a prisoner of a dead-end routine, trying to be strong for his daughter, while dealing with the absence of the only person he dreamed of sharing the burden with. That morning, sitting in his home office, Roger stared at a pile of CVs. It was already the 3rd round of interviews that month, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it would be another waste of time. The words on the papers were jumbled together: experience with children, dedication, responsibility. They were empty adjectives that he had learned not to believe. The first candidate of the day arrived at 9 a.m. She was an impeccable-looking woman with an extensive CV and well-rehearsed answers. Roger listened politely, but the lack of warmth in her voice irritated him. He quickly dismissed the woman, feeling even more skeptical. The next few hours brought other faces, other speeches. Some of the candidates seemed well-meaning, but there was no passion, no spark of authenticity. With each new interview, Roger fought a growing sense of failure. He wondered if he was expecting too much, if it was unfair to demand someone who could love Chloe the way she deserved. But at the same time, he couldn't accept anything less. His daughter needed someone special, someone who could be the heart of that empty house. It was after 3 p.m. when he almost gave up. The last candidate was late, and Roger was getting ready to call it a day. But before he could get up, the door opened and a young woman walked in. She had a vibrant, almost magnetic presence, and something in her posture caught Roger's attention immediately. "My name is Amali Mthembu," she said, with a slight accent. There was a kindness in her voice, a balance between confidence and humility that Roger hadn't seen in the others. "I came from South Africa to study child development. I'm here because I believe I can make a difference in your daughter's life." Amali was young, maybe 25, and seemed to carry with her an energy that filled the room. As she talked about her childhood in a small village and the difficulties she had faced getting to the United States on a scholarship, Roger felt a twinge of curiosity. She was different, not just because of her accent or the liveliness in her eyes, but because she seemed to genuinely believe every word she said. "Do you have experience with autistic children?" Roger asked, crossing his arms, still skeptical. "Yes, Mr. Collins. I worked with autistic children in my village. They taught me that patience and love can open doors that no technique can reach." Amali didn't just talk about technical skills, but about stories. She recounted how she had helped a little girl pronounce her first word, and how she had learned to celebrate the small victories that many overlooked. For her, caring for children wasn't just a job, it was a mission. Roger felt something rare, a spark of hope. But he was no longer the optimistic man he used to be. Years of disappointment had taught him not to trust blindly, and although Amali seemed promising, he knew he needed more than words to make a decision. "Let's do a test," he said, after a long silence. "It won't be easy. Chloe is special. She needs someone who not only understands that, but is also willing to be part of our family." "I understand, Mr. Collins," Amali replied with a sincere smile, "and I'm ready for it." Roger didn't reply. Something inside him was still reluctant, and it was this hesitation that led him to make a decision before Amali even started. He would install cameras in the house. It wasn't something he did lightly, but he felt it was necessary. His confidence had been shaken so many times that now he needed proof, not words. Amali seemed different, but Roger couldn't risk it, not when his daughter's heart was at stake. Amali Mthembu arrived at the Collins house on a sunny early afternoon, bringing with her a small suitcase and a smile that seemed to light up even the darkest corners of the mansion. For Roger, who watched from his office window, that moment was like a final test. He had decided to give Amali a chance, but something inside him still resisted, trapped in the spiral of doubts that had accompanied him since Laura's death. The first interaction between Amali and Chloe was carefully supervised by Roger, who couldn't relax. Chloe was sitting in the corner of the living room, carefully stacking building blocks. It was the kind of activity she did over and over again, a comforting pattern in her private world. When Amali entered the room, she wasn't direct. She didn't try to make conversation or force immediate contact. Instead, she sat down at a respectful distance and began to observe Chloe in silence, with a discreet smile and obvious patience. Roger's heart squeezed. He had seen many nannies try unsuccessfully to enter Chloe's world. Some were frustrated, others gave up, and some simply ignored her. But Amali seemed to understand something that many didn't: the need for time. A few minutes passed before Amali picked up one of the building blocks next to her and carefully began to assemble her own little tower. It wasn't invasive, but rather imitative, mirroring what Chloe was doing. Roger, who was watching everything from his position near the entrance, noticed a subtle detail that disconcerted him. Chloe looked at Amali, even for a brief second. It was a small gesture, but significant. Over the next few hours, Amali was calm, gentle, and incredibly attentive. She followed Chloe's rhythm, respecting her preferences and quirks. Roger, who couldn't take his eyes off the scene, felt something close to hope, but he didn't allow this feeling to blossom completely. He knew that the real test would come when Amali was left alone with her daughter. On the second day, Roger approached Amali while she was organizing Chloe's toys in the girls' room. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "Amal," he began, his voice carrying a seriousness that was not unusual, "I hope you understand that my daughter is not like other children. She needs patience, but also protection. I can't afford to make mistakes again." Amali, with a serene gleam in her eyes, replied, "Mr. Collins, I'm not here to replace you as a father. I'm here to walk alongside you and help Chloe grow up. I don't have all the answers, but I promise to learn and do my best to make her feel safe and loved." Her words hit Roger in an unexpected way, but he remained impassive. He didn't want to be swayed so easily. And that night, while Chloe slept peacefully, Roger began installing the cameras. He knew that many might consider him paranoid, but for him, it was a necessity. He had failed before, and he couldn't afford to fail again. On the third day, with the cameras up and running, Roger decided to observe from a distance while Amali was alone with Chloe for a few hours. He went to his office, but the security monitor screen was always in his field of vision. Amali didn't know about the cameras, and Roger wanted it that way. He needed an unfiltered truth without his presence to influence her behavior. Through the monitor, he saw Amali once again display unwavering patience. Chloe was having a difficult day, which wasn't unusual. She was refusing food, avoiding eye contact, and showing clear signs of sensory overload. Roger felt his chest tighten as he watched Amali try to get closer, knowing that this was a battle that often ended in tears. But Amali didn't seem discouraged. She sat down next to Chloe on the floor, carrying a small picture book in her hands. At first, Chloe ignored her, but Amali began to narrate the story in a low, soft tone, describing the images in detail and imitating the sounds of the animals that appeared. It was a simple gesture, but something about the way she did it seemed almost magical. Roger watched as Chloe slowly began to lean towards Amali. She didn't say anything, but took the book from the nanny's hands and held it tightly. Amali didn't react with exaggerated enthusiasm, but with a discreet smile, as if she understood that this small gesture was a silent victory. That evening, while reviewing the day's recordings, Roger found himself moved. He saw the little details that he might not have noticed live, the way Amali never forced an interaction, how she seemed to understand Chloe's limits without ever crossing them, but also without giving up trying. She had a unique way of being present, of offering comfort without being intrusive. However, even with these moments of connection, something still bothered Roger. He noticed that Amali sometimes seemed distracted. There was a moment when she stared into nothingness, as if lost in her own thoughts. Roger didn't know what to think. She was a young woman full of energy and patience, but what was she hiding? This question echoed in his mind. That same evening, Roger looked at the recordings for longer than he would have liked. He wanted to believe that Amali was everything Chloe needed, but a part of him, the one scarred by years of disappointment, couldn't relax. Over the next few days, Roger began to notice a change. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the slow blooming of a flower in winter. Chloe, his daughter, who had always been reserved and wrapped up in her own world, began to show signs of something he had long desired, but feared he would never see: connection. It was on a rainy afternoon that he first noticed the difference. Chloe was sitting on the balcony, watching the drops fall. Normally, she preferred to be alone at times like this, lost in her thoughts. Amali, instead of trying to invade that space, simply sat next to her, in silence. Roger watched from the window, curious but not expecting much. Amali then began to sing softly. Her voice was sweet and soft, blending a melody that seemed ancient, almost ancestral. Chloe didn't turn around immediately, but Roger saw when her daughter tilted her head slightly, as if absorbing the music. Moments later, Chloe looked at Amali and, with a small but monumental gesture for Roger, took her hand. That scene stuck in his mind like a ray of hope. He began to observe more closely, analyzing every interaction between the two. Amali had infinite patience, something he had never seen before. When Chloe refused to take part in the proposed activities, Amali would find a way to make them more appealing, such as turning a therapy exercise into a game or using music to calm the girl down in moments of anxiety. However, what really touched Roger was the way Chloe seemed to change. There were moments when she would try to verbalize something, even if it was just a word or a sound. Amali celebrated each attempt with a discreet enthusiasm, without exaggeration, but with an authenticity that made Chloe smile. A rare smile, but one that seemed to light up the whole house. In the therapy sessions, Chloe also began to show progress. Before, she resisted, often refusing to enter the therapy room or interact with the therapists. But with Amali by her side, holding her hand or encouraging her with gentle words, Chloe began to participate. Roger heard from the doctors something he hadn't heard for a long time. She's evolving. But even with all these positive signs, something still bothered Roger. He continued to monitor the recordings, carefully reviewing each moment. In general, the images confirmed what he already knew. Amali was dedicated and loving. However, there were small details that deeply intrigued him. He noticed, for example, that Amali sometimes seemed to talk to herself. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to catch his attention. At times when Chloe was distracted or in another room, Amali would mutter words that the cameras picked up almost inaudibly. Sometimes she seemed to be holding objects from the house, a book, an old photograph, even a glass ornament, and looking at them with an intensity that Roger couldn't understand. One evening, while reviewing the recordings, he saw her sitting in the living room with a notebook in her hands. It was the diary of his late wife, Laura. He knew this because he recognized it immediately, even though it was tucked away in a drawer that hadn't been accessed for years. Roger didn't know how the diary had found its way into Amali's hands, but the scene baffled him. Amali seemed absorbed in the pages, and Roger noticed discreet tears streaming down her face. She closed the diary carefully, as if it was something sacred, and put it back. He didn't know what to think. Part of him wanted to confront her immediately, to demand an explanation, but something stopped him. There was a vulnerability in Amali at that moment, something that made him hesitate. The next morning, Roger tried to act normally, but he couldn't shake the questions that were swirling around in his mind. Why was Amali reading Laura's diary? What was she looking for? He began to pay even closer attention to every detail, looking for answers to his doubts. Meanwhile, Chloe continued to flourish under Amali's care. She began to show an interest in activities she had previously ignored, such as painting and playing outside. Roger saw her running in the garden for the first time in years, laughing as Amali blew soap bubbles in the wind. It was such a simple scene, but so charged with emotion that he had to turn away to avoid being seen crying. However, even with these moments of joy, Roger's unease grew. He knew that Amali had secrets, and every detail he picked up during the recording seemed to reinforce this idea. One evening, he watched a video in which Amali was in the kitchen, alone, holding a cup of tea. She seemed to be talking, but there was no one there. Roger amplified the audio, trying to catch the words, but the sound was too low. It was a dilemma. Should he confront her, or should he wait and try to understand more before making any decisions? The relationship of trust that was beginning to form between them was fragile, and he feared breaking it by acting too hastily. Roger spent hours thinking about it. As the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning, he couldn't deny that Amali was doing an incredible job with Chloe. The girl had never progressed so much, never shown such happiness. But the question remained, who was Amali really? Roger was sitting in his study that evening, the silence of the house enveloping every room like a heavy blanket. It was one of those moments when he felt the weight of his loneliness, a burden that refused to be lifted, even with Chloe's advances and Amali's vibrant presence. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, but the drink seemed to have no effect on the tangle of emotions that filled his chest. With the monitor in front of him, he decided, almost as a habit, to review the day's recordings. It was a practice that had recently become a nightly ritual, a way of seeking answers to the doubts that wouldn't let him sleep. He moved through the videos leisurely, watching Amali interact with Chloe. Once again, he found himself impressed by the young woman's patience. Amali didn't just look after Chloe. She seemed to understand her on a level that went beyond words. There was a genuine affection in every gesture, something that touched Roger deeply, but still something bothered him. And then he found the scene that would make him question everything. It was late afternoon on the video, with golden sunlight streaming in through the living room windows. Chloe was sitting on the sofa, apparently calm, while Amali was holding an object that Roger recognized immediately, Laura's diary. His heart raced. He knew that Amali had handled the diary before, but seeing it again brought a wave of emotions that he couldn't control. In the video, Amali opened the diary and began to read. Her lips moved, mumbling words that the cameras couldn't pick up clearly. Roger increased the volume of the audio, but all he could hear were fragments. Courage, love, Chloe. He continued to watch, his eyes locked on the screen. Suddenly, Amali stopped reading and closed the diary, holding it against her chest as if it was something precious. And then something unexpected happened. She started to cry. Not dramatic tears, but silent, almost restrained ones. Amali leaned her head forward, her shoulders shaking slightly. Chloe, who had been quiet until then, looked at Amali curiously. It was a rare moment, as the girl rarely reacted so directly to other people's emotions. To Roger's surprise, Chloe approached and touched Amali's hand gently as if to comfort her. Amali looked up, quickly wiped away her tears and smiled at Chloe, a smile that mixed sadness and gratitude. Roger paused the video. He stared at the screen, trying to understand what he had just seen. On the one hand, he felt something akin to guilt for having invaded such a personal moment, but on the other, he couldn't ignore the questions that began to echo in his mind. Why was Amali crying? What in Laura's diary could have caused that reaction? He tried to convince himself that Amali was just a sensitive young woman, perhaps moved by the words of a woman she had never met, but who nevertheless seemed to have a profound impact on the house. But the other possibility tormented him. Was Amali a manipulator? Someone who was taking advantage of his and Chloe's vulnerability? He felt the bitter taste of distrust, something he knew well, but which had never hurt so much. He tried to push these thoughts away, but they persisted, like a shadow that couldn't be ignored. Later that evening, Roger went to the room where Laura's diary was kept. He opened the drawer and found it exactly where Amali had put it. He sat down on the sofa and started flipping through the pages, looking for something to explain her reaction. Laura's words were familiar, full of love and insecurity about Chloe's future. He felt the same tightness in his chest that he always felt when he read those words, but nothing seemed to justify Amali's tears. As he held the diary, Roger remembered a conversation with Laura before Chloe was born. "If anything happens to me," she had said, "promise me you'll find someone who will love Chloe like I would." At the time, he had dismissed those words, certain that nothing would happen, but now they echoed like a premonition. He wondered if Amali could be that person, but how could he trust her? The next few days were unsettling for Roger. He watched Amali more closely, looking for any sign that might answer his questions. She continued to look after Chloe with the same dedication and affection as always. He saw her improvise a painting session with Chloe in the garden, turning what was just a motor exercise into an explosion of laughter and color. He saw her get up in the middle of the night to comfort Chloe after a bad dream. He even saw her sitting on the balcony, alone, looking up at the sky as if she were praying. But none of this resolved his doubts. On the contrary, it only made them deeper. Amali seemed too perfect, almost too good to be true, and yet he couldn't ignore the sincerity in her eyes, the way Chloe was beginning to blossom under his care. That evening, Roger returned to the monitor. He watched the same recording several times, looking for something that could give him a definitive answer. But all he found was the image of Amali holding Laura's diary, as if it were a connection to something greater, something he couldn't fully understand. Roger spent the whole morning thinking back over the last few days. The scene of Amali crying over Laura's diary wouldn't leave his mind. He tried to carry on with his daily duties, reviewing contracts and answering important calls, but his mind was stuck on that mystery. The mistrust, which he thought was weakening, grew again, suffocating him. He needed answers, and he knew there was only one way to get them, by confronting Amali. At dusk, when Chloe was already in her bed and the house was plunged into an almost solemn silence, Roger went downstairs with Laura's diary in his hands. He found Amali in the kitchen, tidying up the utensils she had used to prepare dinner. She was distracted, humming a soft tune as she washed the dishes, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Roger. Amali. Her voice echoed through the kitchen, firmer than he had expected. She turned, surprised, but her gaze remained as calm as ever. "Can we talk?" "Of course, Mr. Collins." She dried her hands with a cloth and followed him into the living room. She sat down on the sofa while he stood, holding the diary as if it were evidence in a court of law. "I know you found this," said Roger, holding up the diary. "I saw you reading it. I saw you crying. I want to know why. I want to know what you were doing with something so personal." Amali looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and sadness. There was no fear in her eyes, just the same serenity that so confused him. She sighed deeply before replying, "I thought you saw it. I didn't know how to explain, but I guess now I have no choice." "Then explain," he said, crossing his arms, trying to hide his nervousness. "Why were you reading my wife's diary? You had no right to go through her things." Amali lowered her eyes for a moment as if gathering her strength. "I found the diary by accident, Mr. Collins. I was organizing Chloe's closet as part of the job, and it was hidden among some boxes of old memorabilia. When I opened it and read the first few words, I realized it was something special. It wasn't my intention to invade your privacy, but as I read it, I felt there was something I needed to understand." Roger didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to believe her, but another part still struggled with the idea of trusting so easily. "And what exactly did you find so important in this diary that you could justify reading it without permission?" Amali looked up, now full of emotion. "I read the words of a mother who knew she wouldn't be here to raise her daughter. Words of love, of fear, of guilt. Laura wrote about Chloe, about the difficulties she imagined you would face alone. She talked about you, Roger, and how much she trusted you to do the best for Chloe, even without her here. But what touched me most was something she wrote at the end." Amali paused, her voice trembling. "She asked you to find someone who could give Chloe the maternal love she would never have." Roger felt the impact of those words like a punch in the gut. He knew that Laura was an incredibly sensitive woman, but he had never imagined that she could have left such a direct message. He sat down slowly, still holding the diary, as if for the first time he really understood what it meant. "Did Laura ask for this?" he asked almost in a whisper. "Yes," Amali replied. "She didn't use those words exactly, but it was clear to me. She knew that Chloe would need someone more than a devoted father, and as I read, I couldn't hold back the tears because I felt the depth of Laura's love for you both. That's what moved me, Mr. Collins. There were no ulterior motives." Roger looked at Amali, searching for signs of falsehood, but all he found was honesty. Still, he felt a mixture of emotions that he didn't know how to process. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you bring the diary to me?" "I didn't know how you would react," Amali admitted. "And also, I felt connected to Laura's words in a way I can't explain. Maybe because somehow I felt she was talking to me too. I thought about telling you, but I was afraid you'd think I was crossing the line." Roger ran his hands over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. He couldn't deny that Amali was right about one thing. Laura trusted him, but she also knew that he needed help. He had always ignored this aspect, thinking he could carry the burden alone. Now, in front of Amali, he felt like he was failing his wife's last request. "And what do you expect me to do with that?" he asked, his voice lower now. "I don't expect anything, Mr. Collins. I just want you to know that I'm here for Chloe. Everything I do is for her. I'm not trying to replace anyone, least of all Laura, but I believe I can help her to grow up, to be happy, and I know that's what Laura wanted." Amali's words brought tears to Roger's eyes. He hadn't cried for years, but at that moment he felt that the barriers he had built around his heart were beginning to crumble. "Laura was everything to me," he said, his voice almost inaudible. "I lost more than a wife that day. I lost my partner, my support, and Chloe lost the mother she deserved." Amali moved closer, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "I'm not here to replace Laura, but if you allow me, I want to help honor her memory by helping Chloe achieve everything she's capable of." Roger didn't reply immediately. He just nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. For the first time, he began to see Amali not as an intruder, but as an extension of Laura's desire. Maybe, just maybe, she was exactly what he and Chloe needed. The days that followed the conversation about Laura's diary brought a silent but powerful transformation for Roger. He felt a mixture of relief and discomfort. Relief because somehow it seemed that some of the weight he had been carrying alone for so many years had dissipated, but the discomfort came from the realization that perhaps all this time he had been wrong to try to keep people at a distance. Amali continued her work with Chloe, but something had changed in the dynamic of the house. The tension that used to exist, fueled by Roger's mistrust, seemed to have dissolved. He now saw Amali through different eyes. She wasn't just a dedicated employee. She was a woman who, despite her young age, seemed to carry a rare wisdom within her. Her connection with Chloe was not the result of technique or training, but of something much deeper, a genuine care that transcended any professional obligation. Roger began to notice details that he had previously ignored. How Amali adapted each activity to Chloe's mood, turning moments of difficulty into opportunities for growth. He saw her sitting next to the little girl at mealtimes, patiently encouraging her to try new foods. He watched her spend hours helping Chloe organize her toys, even when the little girl insisted on taking everything apart afterwards. He even witnessed Amali waking up in the middle of the night to comfort Chloe during a nightmare, whispering reassuring words in her native language. One evening, Roger was in the office reviewing contracts that seemed insignificant compared to what was really occupying his thoughts. He heard laughter coming from the living room and, curious, went downstairs. He found Chloe and Amali on the floor, surrounded by sheets of paper and scattered inks. Chloe, who rarely expressed her emotions so openly, was laughing as she painted her hands and left colored marks on the paper. Amali, her face also smeared with paint, was laughing along with her. It was such a simple scene, yet so full of meaning, that Roger felt a lump in his throat. "Are you all right in there, Mr. Collins?" Amala asked, noticing his presence. "Yes, I was curious about what was going on here." He tried to sound casual, but his voice was charged with emotion. "We're doing modern art," Amali replied with a smile. "Chloe is a talented artist, in case you didn't know." Roger laughed for the first time in a long time, a genuine laugh. He sat down on the sofa nearby and watched the two of them, feeling something he hadn't felt for years, peace. But peace also brought reflection, and with it, the pain of facing his own fears and regrets. That night, after putting Chloe to bed, Roger found Amali in the kitchen preparing tea. He hesitated for a moment before going in, but finally sat down at the table with her. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice low, "for everything you've done for Chloe, and by extension for me too." Amali looked at him, surprised, but said nothing. She just waited for him to continue. "I always thought I had to face all this alone," he admitted. "When Laura died, I closed myself off from the world. I thought that if I let anyone in, I'd be betraying her memory. But now I see that I was wrong. I could never replace Laura, and I never wanted to. But maybe I was so focused on protecting her in my memory that I ended up distancing myself from everything and everyone, including Chloe." Amali listened to him attentively, without interrupting, her eyes conveying a silent understanding. "You've brought something to this house that I thought I'd lost forever," Roger continued, his voice breaking. "Joy, life. Chloe is changing. She's happier, more open, and I know it's because of you. I can't thank you enough for that." Amali put her cup of tea on the table and smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "I don't do this out of gratitude, Mr. Collins. I do it because I really believe that Chloe is an amazing girl, and because I feel that's where I should be." There was a moment of silence between them, charged with emotion but comfortable. It was as if finally Roger had allowed a bridge to be built where before there had only been a chasm. Over the next few days, the relationship between Roger and Amali began to change in subtle but significant ways. He found himself sharing more about Laura, about the kind of person she was, and the love they had for Chloe before she was even born. He told stories he had never told anyone, while Amali listened attentively, absorbing every word as if they were pieces of a puzzle. Chloe also continued to blossom. During a therapy session, the therapist commented that the girl was showing significant progress in her communication and social interaction skills. "It's as if she's found a new motivation," said the therapist, looking at Amali with a grateful smile. But for Roger, Chloe's progress wasn't just technical. It was the sparkle in her eyes, the sound of her laughter, and the way she now sought out his presence, something he feared would never happen. He began to wonder if the real cure was not just for Chloe, but for him too. The night was especially quiet. Roger was sitting on the sofa in the living room, lost in thought. The lights were low, and the only sound was the faint crackling of the fireplace. Chloe had been asleep for hours, and Amali was in the kitchen washing the last cup of tea she had used. He watched her from afar, realizing for the first time how small she seemed in front of the immensity of the house. She had a vibrant presence, but there was something about her posture that night that seemed weighted down. Roger felt an impulse he couldn't explain, something that made him want to break the distance that still existed between them. Amali finished cleaning her cup, dried her hands, and turned around, noticing Roger's gaze. "Are you all right, Mr. Collins?" she asked, her tone soft but attentive. "Roger," he corrected automatically. "I think you can call me Roger now." She smiled, a brief but genuine smile. "Is everything all right, Roger?" "I could ask you the same," he replied, raising an eyebrow. "You seem distant tonight." Amali hesitated, surprised by the remark. It was unusual for Roger to ask such personal questions. She pulled up a chair and sat down at the nearby table. "I guess I'm thinking of home, my family in South Africa." "You miss them," Roger said, more than asked. "Every day," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "It's a constant weight knowing that I'm so far away. I think of my mother, my father, my brothers. They supported me so much so that I could come here. And now sometimes I wonder if I made the right decision, whether being here is worth the sacrifice of being away from them." Roger remained silent, feeling the weight of her words. He couldn't imagine what it was like to be so far away from everything familiar, especially when Amali's own mission there was to support another family. "You've made it more than worthwhile," he said at last. "You've changed everything here, not just for Chloe, but for me too." He hesitated before continuing. "I know it doesn't replace your family, but I don't know what we'd do without you." Amali smiled again, but this time there was a sadness in her eyes. "That's good to hear, but it's also scary." "Why scary?" Roger asked, confused. "Because sometimes I find myself wondering if I'm getting too involved. Chloe isn't just a child I look after. She's become an important part of my life, and so have you, Roger. But I don't know where it ends. I don't know if I'll ever go home and leave all this behind, and that scares me." Roger felt a lump in his throat. He had never considered the fact that Amali might leave. The idea hit him like a punch, leaving him momentarily speechless. "Do you think you'll have to leave?" he asked, his voice lower than he had intended. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I think about it every day, but at the same time, every day I spend here makes the idea of leaving more difficult." There was a tense silence between them, broken only by the crackling of wood in the fireplace. Roger stared into the fire, feeling a wave of guilt and fear. "I know what it's like to feel like you can't move on," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. "After Laura died, I locked myself in a world where everything revolved around not failing Chloe. I thought that if I kept moving, working, taking care of her, I would be honoring Laura's memory. But in reality, I was just running away." Amali looked up at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "And you feel like you're still running away?" "Until recently, yes," he admitted. "But you showed me that there's another way to live, that looking after Chloe doesn't mean carrying everything yourself. And more than that, you brought joy into her life, something I thought would never be possible after Laura left." Amali didn't know what to say. The depth of Roger's words touched her in a way she hadn't expected. "You don't have to be afraid to move on, Roger," she said softly. "Moving on doesn't mean forgetting Laura. It means honoring her, finding ways to continue to love and be loved." "I know," he replied, his voice almost a whisper. "But knowing that and accepting it are two different things." Amali nodded, understanding perfectly. "I feel like we're in the same situation then. I'm afraid of leaving my family behind. You're afraid of leaving Laura behind. But maybe we can face this together." Roger raised his eyes to her, and in that moment something changed between them. It was as if they had both found a shared strength, something that connected them on a deeper level than anything they could express in words. In the days that followed, Roger began to make more room for Amali in his life, not just as Chloe's carer, but as someone he could trust. He shared more stories about Laura, not with sadness, but with a fondness that had previously been buried under pain. Amali, for her part, began to talk more about her family in South Africa, about the traditions she missed and the sacrifices she made to be there. Together, they began to face their fears, finding strength in each other. Chloe was still the link that bound them together, but now there was something more, something that was beginning to grow slowly, like a barely flickering flame, but which had the potential to become a blazing fire. Spring had arrived, bringing with it a freshness that seemed to reflect the changes within the Collins household. The mansion, once just a cold structure, had become a home full of life. The days of dreary silence had given way to occasional laughter, the sound of Chloe playing and the constant presence of Amali, who filled the empty spaces with her vibrant energy. Roger began to notice that the sadness that had previously weighed on him was being replaced by something lighter, something he almost didn't recognize: hope. Chloe, who had previously avoided eye contact and isolated herself in her routines, was now showing advances that Roger had never imagined possible. One sunny morning, he saw her running around the garden chasing soap bubbles that Amali was blowing. She laughed, a sound he hardly knew his daughter was capable of making. He stood on the balcony, watching the scene with watery eyes. For so long he had thought that moments like that were out of reach, a fantasy he didn't allow himself to dream. Amali was kneeling on the grass, laughing along with Chloe, encouraging her to jump higher, to reach for the bubbles that were rising into the sky. From time to time she glanced at Roger, as if to include him in that little bubble of happiness. He, shy at first, began to join in. He took Chloe in his arms, spinning her in the air, while she stretched out her arms towards the bubbles. It was simple, but extraordinary. Over time, moments like this became commonplace. Chloe began to trust Amali more, to seek her out for support and comfort. When she had a difficult day at therapy, it was Amali she wanted by her side. When she faced a sensory overload crisis, Amali knew exactly what to do to calm her down. But what touched Roger most was seeing how Chloe began to seek Amali out in moments of joy. Small victories, like learning a new word or completing an activity, were shared with her before Roger was even told. Chloe would look at Amali with a sparkle in her eyes, something he knew was rare. Despite the progress, there were challenges. On one particularly difficult night, Chloe had a crisis that lasted for hours. She cried, inconsolable, and none of the usual techniques seemed to work. Roger tried to intervene, but Chloe pushed him away, something he knew he shouldn't take personally, but which still hurt deeply. Amali remained calm, sitting on the floor next to Chloe, singing a soft melody in her native language. Even though he didn't understand the words, Roger felt the tenderness in her voice. Little by little, Chloe began to calm down, leaning her head on Amali's lap as her tears dried. When everything was finally quiet, Roger sat down next to them, emotionally exhausted. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "How can you reach her when even I can't?" Amal looked at him kindly. "It's not magic, Roger. It's just love. Chloe feels it, and that's what helps her to trust." Her words struck him deeply. For so long, he had carried the guilt of thinking that he wasn't enough for Chloe, that his love, however genuine, couldn't break through the barriers of her world. But maybe Amali was right. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect, but about being there with an open heart. A few weeks later, one moment changed everything. It was a quiet evening, and they were gathered in the living room. Chloe was sitting on the floor with her building blocks, something she loved. Amali was next to her, helping her put together a tower. Roger, with a book in his hands, watched from his spot on the sofa, enjoying the serenity of the moment. Suddenly, Chloe looked at Amali and said, in her small, hesitant voice, "Mommy." The world seemed to stop. Roger looked up from the book, his heart racing. Amali froze, as if unsure if she had heard correctly. Chloe repeated, now more firmly, "Mama." She took Amali's hand, a shy smile lighting up her face. Amali brought her hand to her chest, as if she needed to hold it in to stop herself from bursting into tears. "Oh, Chloe," she murmured, pulling the girl into a gentle hug. Tears streamed down Amali's face, but they were tears of joy, an emotion so pure that it filled the room with warmth. Roger, sitting there, felt a mixture of emotions that he didn't know how to process. There was a hint of jealousy, a selfish feeling that he tried to ignore, but above all there was gratitude. He knew that Chloe didn't call Amali Mama because she had forgotten Laura, but because she had found someone who filled the void left by her absence. Someone who loved her with the same intensity and dedication. That night, after putting Chloe to bed, Roger found Amali on the balcony, looking up at the stars. He joined her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Finally, he spoke. "You know that means you're part of our family now, right?" Amali smiled, but her eyes were still moist with emotion. "I never wanted to take Laura's place, Roger, but if Chloe sees me like this, it's because she found something she needed. Laura would be proud of you," he said, his voice full of sincerity, "and of me too for finally understanding what she wanted for Chloe." The two of them stood there side by side as the night unfolded around them, united by something that went beyond words. They were no longer just a boss and a nanny. They were no longer just two people trying to help Chloe. They were a growing family, finding strength in the connection they had built together. Winter seemed milder that morning, as if the world was conspiring to make the day special. Chloe was playing in the garden, her laughter echoing through the frosty air as she chased snowflakes that had accumulated on the ground. Amali, wrapped in a scarf, watched her intently, always ready to intervene if necessary. Roger, standing on the balcony with a cup of coffee in his hands, looked at the two of them with a mixture of apprehension and tenderness. That night, he had made a decision that would change their lives forever. But before he acted, Roger knew he needed to revisit everything that had brought him to this point. He sat down in his office and opened a drawer he rarely touched. Inside were old photographs, a wedding ring he hadn't worn for years, and at the bottom, a letter from Laura that he had kept, but never fully read. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the paper and began to read. Laura's words were gentle but charged with emotion. "If anything happens to me, Roger," she had written, "I want you to know that I trust you to give Chloe everything she needs. But trust yourself too. Allow yourself to find love again, because Chloe deserves to grow up in a home full of life and joy. Promise yourself that you won't close yourself off from the world." Roger felt a tear run down his cheek as he closed the letter. For years he had avoided it, thinking that by following Laura's request he would somehow be betraying her memory. But now, with Amali and Chloe in his life, he understood that moving on wasn't about forgetting. It was about honoring. With a deep sigh, he put the letter away and picked up the small box that had been hidden in his pocket for weeks. The next morning, he waited for the right moment. Chloe was excited to bake cookies with Amali, and the kitchen was a mess of giggles and scattered flour. Amali, patient as ever, helped Chloe cut out irregular shapes with the molds, encouraging her with sweet words. Roger watched them from the doorway, his heart racing. That was it. He didn't need anything else. "Amali," he said, his voice firm but charged with emotion, "can you help me with something in the garden?" She looked at him, curious, but nodded. "Sure. Chloe, finish cutting the cookies and call me if you need any help, okay?" Chloe nodded enthusiastically, concentrating on the task at hand. Amali took off her apron and followed Roger into the garden. The snow still covered the ground, and the landscape looked like something out of a dream. He guided her to a bench under a leafy tree, the cold air making both of their breaths form clouds. "Roger, is everything all right?" Amali asked, her voice full of concern. "It's more than fine," he replied, taking a deep breath. "In fact, it's perfect. And that's why I need to say something." He knelt down in the snow, ignoring the cold that penetrated his knees. Taking the small box out of his pocket, he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. "Amali Mathembu, you came into our lives when I thought nothing could save us. You brought light to me, to Chloe, to this house. You're the reason we're a family again, and I can't imagine a future without you. So I want to ask you, will you marry me?" Amali covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. For a moment she was speechless, but then she bent down, placing her hands in his. "Yes, Roger, but I need you to understand something. I accept because I love you and Chloe with everything I am. But I'm afraid of not being enough, afraid of losing who I am in all this." Roger held her hands tightly. "You won't lose who you are, Amali. And if you're afraid, we'll face it together. You've given us so much. Now it's our turn to take care of you." Amali nodded, finally smiling through her tears. "Then yes, I accept." When they returned to the kitchen, Chloe looked at them curiously. Roger knelt down beside her and said, Amali said she's going to stay with us forever. She's going to be your mommy now. Chloe frowned thoughtfully before giving a shy smile. Then, to the surprise of both of them, she stretched out her arms and hugged Amali tightly, something she had never done before. "Mommy," Chloe murmured, her voice small but full of meaning. Amali began to cry again, holding Chloe as if she was never going to let her go. Roger, overcome with emotion, wrapped his arms around both of them, feeling that they were finally complete. Over the next few months, the house became a reflection of the joy that now filled their lives. Amali began decorating Chloe's room with small lights and vibrant colors, while Roger rearranged his schedule to spend more time with the family. Chloe continued to blossom, each day more confident and happy. One sunny afternoon, Roger found the two of them in the garden, painting a large canvas with their hands, laughing as they smeared themselves with paint. He joined them, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter full of love, understanding, and possibilities. If you liked this story and want to see more like it, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Don't miss the video that's appearing on your screen right now. Click to continue following stories that will move you.